I'm Andrew Torget with Texas History for Teachers. Now imagine just for a second the excitement that so many Texans felt in December of 1845 when their home, Texas, finally joined the United States as the 28th state in the Union. It was a moment that most Texans had eagerly awaited since 1836, and it seemed to promise a bright and prosperous future for the region. But then, only 15 years later, in 1861, Texas suddenly left the United States in anger when the state seceded to join the new Confederate States of America. What on earth happened during those 15 years? Well, the answer, as it turns out, is a lot. And not just for Texas, but for the whole United States. Now, the first thing that happened was enormous. There was a war between the United States and Mexico from 1846 to 1848. And this was directly linked to Texas. You see, Mexico had never accepted Texan claims to be independent. So when the U.S. moved to make Texas part of the United States, Mexico screamed that that was illegal. And the U.S. president at the time, James K. Polk, then used the dispute to force Mexico into a tough position, and then a war broke out. And when the American army then captured Mexico City in 1847, the U.S. forced Mexico to give up its claims, not just to Texas, but to all the land between Texas and California. And this forever changed both the United States and Mexico and created the modern boundary separating the two countries that we still have today. Now, after the war came another great change. Americans began pouring into Texas, and the population of the state just shot up dramatically. In 1847, there were about 140,000 people living in Texas, but only 3 years later, there were more than 200,000. And then, by 1860, there were more than 600,000. That's a lot of people. And they came for a lot of reasons, but most of them came for cheap land and the opportunity to grow cotton, which was booming during the 1850s as sky-high cotton prices offered people a chance to get wealthy. Now, that might have been fine and dandy for many Americans coming to Texas, but that population surge caused big problems for other groups. This new wave of settlers, for example, brought a lot of Americans much closer to the territories claimed by various Indian tribes, which, as a result, put tremendous new pressures on groups like the Comanches. This flood of settlers also brought increased tensions for Mexican Americans living in Texas, who we often call Tejanos. Most Tejanos lived around San Antonio, and they had been very supportive in the 1820s and the 1830s when Americans first started coming into Texas during the Mexican period. But after Texas joined the United States in 1845, most of the hundreds of thousands of new settlers who began pouring into Texas either didn't know or just really didn't care that Tejanos had been key allies of Americans moving to Texas during earlier periods. And after the US-Mexico War, many of these new Americans really didn't like anyone of Mexican heritage, which led to conflicts and sometimes violence between Anglo-American and Mexican-American communities in Texas. For African Americans, life changed dramatically during this period because Texas became one of the fastest-growing slave states in the United States. The enslaved population skyrocketed from around 40,000 people in 1847 to more than 180,000 people by 1860. And this was because Texas had become part of the Deep South of the United States, where cotton was king, and by the 1850s, Texas produced more cotton than any other state in the nation. But by the 1850s, cotton production in the US depended heavily on slavery. And largely because of Texas, slavery had been expanding westward, which was creating increased tensions between northern states, which didn't like slavery and did not want it to expand, and southern states like Texas, which believed that slavery was crucial for cotton farming and therefore wanted it to expand. This pitted northern states against southern states, with each side trying to control how the US government handled the issue of slavery. And the key to that was controlling whether new states created from western territories would join the US as either free states or slave states. Because, remember, each state gets 2 senators for the US Congress. That meant that if the North could somehow carve out new free states, or if the South could somehow carve out new slave states, then that side could significantly increase their own power in the US Congress, and then maybe control the future of slavery for the whole country. That's why the war that Texas started, the US-Mexico War, really matters, because what did it produce? It brought a massive amount of land, everything from Texas to California, the modern American Southwest, into the United States. That meant that the question that dominated the 1850s, not just for Texas, but for the whole country, was whether all that western land could be used to create free states or slave states. And just to make things even crazier, gold was discovered during this time in California, which brought a massive rush of people to the west and forced the US Congress to start making decisions about western territories sooner than anyone ever expected. And so what followed was, no surprise, a series of fights between the North and the South over slavery and the West, with most Texans on the side of the South. Which brings us back to the question that we started with. What happened during those crucial 15 years that would eventually lead so many Texans to want to abandon the United States?